Thank you. Good morning and welcome to the Legal and Justice Committee of the Incarceration Prevention Reduction Task Force, Legal and Justice. It is July 11th at 11:32 in the morning. I'd like to begin with the land acknowledgement statement. Before we begin, we acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional and unceded territory of the Lummi, Nooksack, Samish, and Semiahmoo people who have cared for and tended this land since time immemorial. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We pay respect to their elders, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here together today. And please join us in uncovering such truths at any and all public events. I'll call this meeting to order. Thank you all for being here. The first item on the agenda today is the use of MCOT and the Deacon Center for Hope. This has been brought up at some of the other meetings, and we're looking at for statistics, possibly a survey, questions that we may want to ask law enforcement or other agencies that are using or that have not used the facility on how to make the center more accessible to individuals that want to use it. Perry, did you get any more information on this for us?
You know, what I did at this point was actually reached out to Amy Pereira. Amy is Compass Health Director of Crisis Response and Stabilization. And I thought that maybe that would be a good place to start, just in terms of getting some input and some information. I've also reached out to find out what information the BHASO keeps in connection to their contract with Compass Health. They contract with Compass Health directly, and but I don't have that information available at this point. But I'll continue to work on that. So I thought maybe what I would do is introduce Amy, and we can go from there.
That'd be great. Before we get started, Amy, if I could just get Perry to define VHSO for the public.
Of course. Sorry. Our Behavioral Health Administrative Services Organization, quasi governmental entity that essentially holds, amongst other things, the funding and resources that come through the state in connection to crisis-related services. Other services are funded through our managed care organizations. So yeah, thanks. Sorry, Raylene.
That's all right. Thank you. Take it away, Amy.
Hi, so I'm Amy. I'm as Perry said, the Director of Crisis Response and Stabilization for Compass Health. So ironically, I oversee the Compass side of the Deacon Center for Hope, so the mental health side of it, as well as our mobile crisis outreach teams. So for Whatcom County, that's Whatcom County, our voluntary team, as well as the designated crisis responders, which are those individuals that can pull someone's civil rights and put them on civil commitment hold for the 120 hours. So I oversee those two teams in the county, or excuse me, those two programs in the county, as well as programs outside of Whatcom County. So I don't know specifically what would be helpful to share. I wasn't able to pull a lot of actual data. I was notified of this meeting on Thursday. And for instance, for our mobile crisis outreach teams, we've done 3,500 services actually the first half of the year. I only pulled from January to June. And so I perhaps could get something for future dates, but I could also answer any other questions that people may have.
I'll open it up to everybody here for questions that you may have for Amy. I think the one thing that we're kind of wondering is how much is this being used by law enforcement? And if it's more on Whatcom County and just Bellingham, or if you're seeing small cities as well as medical providers, and or just the general public, and any gaps that you see or problems with people trying to use the center, like just families that want to drop their kids off. I know there was a concern with somebody that had dual diagnosis with drug and crisis mental health issues, if they would be able to use that facility or if they have to go somewhere else, all those questions that a lot of people have.
So starting with your last question first, and then I have some clarifying pieces. So yes, we commonly see people who may have a dual mental health and substance use diagnosis. On the Compass Health side, we cannot treat substance use disorders. So if we see someone if their tox screen is positive, that is not a rule out for us. That's just something we're mindful of. But if someone starts to show symptoms of withdrawals, we can't treat that. So then we have to look at an alternative placement. Most often for us, that is across the hallway to Pioneer Human Services. We also do treat people who are often at Pioneer Human Services. Maybe they have gone through their withdrawal symptoms, but they're still showing some symptoms of mental health, where they will pass them to us. So we do have some fluidity of getting people kind of which center or which unit makes the most sense. But we can only treat basically mental health patients. So if it's solely a substance use piece, then that definitely has to go to Pioneer. But if there is comorbidity, we see that quite often. We just have to ensure that they don't start going through detox or withdrawal symptoms because we can't treat that. So, and we can't do like tapers, like benzo tapers, we're not able to do. So even if that's prescribed somewhere else, we are not able to do that type of medication. We can only do mental health medications or physical health medications that were prescribed somewhere else, but someone may bring with them to the facility.
Okay.
And then I guess the referral question, I was more curious, do you want my hat on as the MCOT person? Are you asking more for the triage side? I do have our January stats, so I can kind of give an idea of where referrals came from. What is the most important for the group?
I think both, but does anybody else have any requests on that? I'm getting a thumbs up from Tank, so we could get both.
Perfect. So looking only because I have it in front of me on our triage side, so the Deacon Center for Hope, the crisis stabilization unit that we have, it looks like in January or in June, there's 142 referrals. The majority of them came from the hospital. So those are normally somebody who doesn't meet criteria to be hospitalized. They agree to come to the triage center. We take them that way. And or maybe they were on the inpatient unit, but they're getting ready for discharge, and this is another step down to help them get back into the community. Or excuse me, the most were actually family of self-referral. So 72 people were either self-referred or their family referred them. 38 were from Peace Health. We had 1 jail transfer. 2 people came from law enforcement, looks like. And then the rest, 25, 30-ish were kind of just throughout. So whether they're MCOT, other professional referrals, we had a handful from base camp, 1 person from the Grace team. So it is a variety, but the majority are self-referred and or the family is referring them to us.
Okay, thank you.
For MCOT, the data is a lot more scattered because, like I said, we have a lot of services and we don't track. So I know the question had been brought to me about how many people or services we had done within the city limits versus outside. And unfortunately, that's not data we collect. We collect people's addresses, but we don't collect where they are, where the services are necessarily performed. We also don't have a way of getting that data without going into each chart directly and doing a lot of digging. So it's a lot of manual pieces of it. Like I said, we had 3,500 services that were performed in so far from January 1st to June 30th. So that is quite a bit. And we do see people all throughout Whatcom County. The majority, I would assume, are kind of Bellingham proper, but we do get quite a few in Linden as well as Ferndale or other kind of hotspots for us. And I could potentially get some clearer data for the next meeting if that would be helpful. It would just take longer than I've had to comprise anything.
Barry?
Yeah, I thought I might also share some information about the withdrawal management services in the Crisis Stabilization Center along the same lines of what Amy had shared in terms of June. There were 220 referrals for detox services. The highest number referent is in the category of self and family. The next highest was all professionals, and then Peace Health is also up fairly frequent referent for detox services. They had a total of 84 unduplicated individuals during the month of June. One of the things that we look at is the number of available bed days, which is the number of days in the month times 16 beds. Each of the units has 16 beds available in mental health stabilization and withdrawal management. So we multiply that out by the number of days in the month, and there's a total of 480 available bed days. There were a total of 374 bed days utilized, which is about a 78% utilization of available beds through the month of June. Yeah, maybe that's enough information at this point in time. I am also going to compile the first quarter's worth of information, or I'm sorry, the second quarter 2023 data and information from the Crisis Stabilization Center and present that during our July 17th IPRTF main meeting. So I will be sharing that information as well for folks. So
Excellent. Chief Tanksley.
Sure. Thank you so much for all that information. You know, I'm trying to figure out how we can increase the number of law enforcement referrals. Because when I look at the numbers that Amy gave, 2 law enforcement referrals in June, that's about 1.5% of the total referrals of the 142. So is the 2 referrals, Amy, for June, is that kind of static for the previous months, or is that an outlier?
I would have to go back and check, but I don't feel like we have been getting a lot of law enforcement referrals recently, and I'm not sure why. I do know, and I believe this was mentioned in last month's meeting, that we did get set up to do the 12-hour law enforcement holds. So on our side, we're also prepared for those as well. And my understanding is that we still haven't had any of those occur. So I don't know where the disconnect is, or what, if anyone has ideas of what we can do. I think that would be appreciated. But we are not getting a lot of law enforcement drop-offs.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Perry, I'm gonna ask Alex Copeland to help me out here. She's kind of being thrown in this unexpectedly, because I actually have her for the second half of the meeting. Alex Copeland, or is it Alexandra or Alex? Sorry.
Oh, Alexandra's fine.
Okay, thank you. Alexandra Copeland is the records supervisor for the Bellingham Police Department. And I was just curious if, do you know if you guys are able to keep records or track records when you're using long arm to see if somebody's been referred to the crisis stabilization unit?
I know that consistently tracking those records through our records management system, LongArm, has been a struggle in the past, and that we sort of have faltered because there are various different referral programs. And so tracking a referral to one specific program, like the Crisis Stabilization Unit versus any of the other available community resources, has proven difficult. So that's a very long way of saying we can track referrals, but we can't track specific referrals. I don't know if that helps you at all.
Gives me a little bit to go on. Thank you.
Sure thing.
Perry?
yeah, I thought that maybe drop back and also answer, at least from my perspective, Chief Tanksley's question of what we can do, steps that we can take. I think that folks are aware that we have a monthly Crisis Stabilization Center Advisory Committee. It is made up of law enforcement, EMS, fire, the providers, and obviously the county as well. Also, Peace Health does attend. And so one of the things that we talked about in this in July's meeting was the development of a visor card for law enforcement. As a matter of fact, Chief Tanksley sent some previous visor cards to me that had been utilized. I think it was from Response Systems Division and more general referrals and so forth. And so we put together a visor card, and I don't know, I guess I can't really share in this meeting. I'm not certain that I'm actually able to. Oh, I guess I can. I take it back. Is that okay, Raylene?
Yes, please.
Hopefully folks can see that. That's about as large as I can make it, I think. Maybe that's a little bit better. I'll just kind of describe the title at the top. I know that it's cutting it off a little bit. The left side, again, it's going to be a double-sided card. The purpose of it being to provide to law enforcement, other first responders, that they can just keep in the visor for quick reference. The left side is very general information around the Crisis Stabilization Center, that it is voluntary, that the individuals need to be 18 years of age and older, etc. And so it sort of walks through that piece and also talks about the conditions that would require a higher level of care in number 3. This sometimes is not fully understood by individuals that are attempting to utilize a Crisis Stabilization Center, but essentially an individual cannot be admitted that requires oxygen replacement therapy, that is on oxygen. The licensing and certification of the Crisis Stabilization Center won't allow that legally. Also, that the individual essentially needs to be able to independently address their daily living requirements. Those would include, bathing, dressing, being able to move, toileting, being able to eat unassisted, and the other description being, a behavior that's suitable for group living. Again, what a lot of times individuals, the community may not understand is this is a voluntary facility. The staff cannot go hands-on if an individual is presenting aggressively, etc. And individuals can request to leave, and of course they're allowed to do so. On the right-hand side, what we also did for law enforcement was a very specific first responder law enforcement set of steps. That is to call the Crisis Stabilization Center, speak with the side of the facility that they would like to make the referral to. If sometimes law enforcement or first responders have indicated we're not sure, which of course the Crisis Stabilization Center staff will help address that particular piece. And as Amy had made reference, work with each other if the need is other than what the facility or the program provides. Staff will confirm an open bed. This is the most important piece. Is I need to know, as law enforcement or first responder, is there an open bed? I've got somebody, I'm wanting to bring them over. I need to know if there's an open bed. And so they confirmed that and essentially ask 5 questions that are the key questions and sort of relate back to the conditions that might require a higher level of care. Obviously, the client's name and date of birth, the presenting concern that the officer or first responder is having, if they have blood alcohol level, what the blood alcohol level might be for an individual. It is a bit different in terms of what can be admitted in the side 4 mental health triage, which is 0.25 BAC. The detox facility is prepared to be able to take an individual with a 0.35 blood alcohol content into the facility. Higher than that does require an ER visit for medical clearance. And then back to the same pieces that we were talking about before. Does the individual require oxygen? Are they able to address their ADLs or their daily living requirements on their own? And also, if the individual happens to be a sex offender, this isn't actually a disqualifier, but the staff are required to set up particular guides and a plan in place if an individual is a level 3 sex offender, and if the individual is combative or threatening. From that point, in having been able to answer those 5 questions, the staff will request that the law enforcement bring the individual in. So what we're trying to do is as streamlined a process as possible. What folks do need to understand that, for example, with withdrawal management services, I think that everybody's probably pretty aware that there are some fairly serious substances going on out there that can very much put an individual's life at risk in terms of overdose and that sort of thing. And so a portion of the intake and admission process can take some time, depending on what's going on for the individual. But we have continued to communicate with the providers, and they certainly understand that it's like, no, we get it, that law enforcement and first responders need to get back out and on patrol or into the community. And so addressing that intake and admission as quickly as possible. So I wanted to share that. That was one step I thought in response to Chief Tanksley's question of what can we do. Also, as Amy had made reference, there is staff in place to be able to accept a 12-hour law enforcement hold. This 12-hour law enforcement hold, if folks aren't aware, it's actually based in the RCW. The RCW 1031-110 allows for a 12-hour law enforcement hold to be placed on an individual if the police office or the sheriff's office chooses to have a low-level offender that could possibly be diverted from the jail, brought to the Crisis Stabilization Center. There's essentially a discussion that happens and a bit of documentation that is maintained in regard to the individual understanding that they are required to remain for a 12-hour period of time. And then obviously, if the 12 hours has passed, the staff is going to work with the individual in order to keep them at the facility for the length of time that it's appropriate for them to get the services and treatment that they need. But also, if an individual leaves prior to the 12-hour period occurring, then the responsibility of the provider at that point is to make contact with the law enforcement office to report the information that the individual has left. And it's been brought up and discussed, and we discussed it actually in our last Crisis Stabilization Center Advisory Committee, that the officer or deputy would likely be off shift at that point in time and wouldn't necessarily respond. And that was certainly understood, but that the actual RCW does require the crisis stabilization staff to make contact with the law enforcement office if an individual does leave. And to this date, as was discussed before, there has not been a 12-hour law enforcement hold drop-off. We are also, I know that my manager and I also have a meeting that we're scheduling with Chief Mertzig to talk a little bit about, the availability of the service, and then determine, if there are other steps that we can take to provide information, et cetera, to facilitate support either 12-hour law enforcement hold, which is not a requirement, but making that available, and also informing law enforcement, just across the county, that there is availability and contact information, and answer any questions that might have. So wanted to add that particular piece, and of course, continue to be open to other, approaches and options, because we'd love to see law enforcement use this more, and certainly understand some of the challenges that brings.
Thank you. Is there any other questions from the group? Hearing none at this time. The only other thing that I know that we had talked about at the steering committee, and I spoke with Caleb Erickson about maybe the index committee assisting us in getting some type of survey to go out to law enforcement officers, allowing officers to be anonymous on their name, but maybe putting their agency and questions that might be of assistance to them to find out if they've used it, why they won't use it, any other questions that anybody in the group might have that we could put on that survey, that we could get out to the index committee to assist us in trying to maybe help use this facilities more by law enforcement and EMS services would be helpful. I think on to the next topic. The next item is stemming from the recent Washington State Patrol stakeholders meeting involving criminal history records and how accurate records are needed for pretrial and conviction proceedings. I just lost my screen that I was reading from, so I'm going to go back there. Hopefully, yay. I would like to introduce a few individuals at this meeting that might be able to assist them in there. Doug Hildall is a local attorney who's been practicing for years and does a fabulous job. He's also been a pro tem judge for the city of Blaine, many other areas, and he is currently the presiding tribal judge for Nooksack. Tom Leyden is a local attorney. He was a public defender for Ferndale. He is now the presiding judge for the city of Everson and pro tem judge for Sumas and Blaine. Rajiv Majumdar is the Blaine City prosecutor. He is also pro tem'd in district court and I believe superior court as well as a commissioner. But he can correct me if I'm wrong on that. He's also the mental health prosecutor. And then Alexandra Copeland is the records custodian for the city of Bellingham, as I mentioned earlier, because I just love to throw people on the spot. So in the stakeholders meeting, it came up that our numbers are quite low on people getting fingerprinted and the information being provided to the state patrol. So that's something we need to work on. Also, things that came up was what are needed when somebody is charged with a crime, and we need to get those records, and sometimes they're not readily accessible. So Jill, if you could share the screen that I sent you earlier on appearances by defendant. This is a crime that's arrested by law enforcement that the jail has to book on, domestic violence charges. And as you can see, the defendant arrested shall be required to be seen within 1 judicial day after the arrest. The prosecutors shall provide for the court's review the defendant's criminal history, if available, criminal history that occur in tribal jurisdictions, individual order history, and the defendant's firearm history, including any concealed pistol license history, which is a little bit of an issue sometimes on trying to get those records and trying to get them quickly when somebody is arrested, especially when the court has to see somebody right away. And then there's pretrial processes that we have to do, the judges have to determine when they're setting release conditions. So if you can take that back down, Jill, for me, just wanted to give people a little bit of an idea of what we were dealing with and why. And if you can bring me back to the group and stop sharing the screen. Thank you. Anyways, so I think I'm going to ask, so I'll start with Doug Hildall. One issue that we're having is getting tribal records. I don't know that we've ever been able to get tribal records, and I don't know if you're able to provide any insight on that.
Not really. I haven't had that request since I've been serving as tribal judge here since August 1st. So I'm not familiar with the process for trying to get them. Certainly, if that request was made, we would respond. But no, I can't really tell you exactly how to do that. So sorry not to be more help.
That's all right. I just figured I'd see if you had any ideas there. And Rajiv Majumdar has actually had some work with, has worked with the tribes before and in the past with Tulalip. But I don't know if you've had any success in getting criminal histories from tribal jurisdictions for any of our cases. Mr. Majumdar, do you have any input on that?
I mean, the real problem is there's just an electronic sharing agreement. I mean, I'm sure if the state wants to come underwrite tribe systems, I'm sure the tribes are always happy to take money for improvements that would integrate them into our systems. But I mean, they're just different sovereign entities altogether. So there's just not a basis of connection unless both sides put the infrastructure and effort in to make the basis.
Thank you. And then I'm gonna turn it over to Alex Copeland and let her give some input on records and how easy it is for them to provide that information to prosecution prior to being heard in court on their first appearance or at conviction.
So I don't know about tribal records, but I know for Bellingham, what we do is anytime there's an arrest that would require that information to be checked, we run it for our officers beforehand so that the referring documents show the appropriate charge. So that's one of the reasons the Washington State has given as an acceptable reason to pull a criminal history. And so assuming that those criminal histories are up to date, that gives us the appropriate charging information. In my experience, where that falls apart is making sure those criminal histories are up to date. And those things like gun purchases and concealed pistol license records are also up to date. So a little bit of background there. Those are held in two separate databases. One is run by Washington State Patrol, which has your criminal history repository, and all the gun information is held by Department of Licensing. So while they can be accessed through the same data systems for criminal justice entities, they are held to very different standards for accuracy and updating. So that means that your domestic violence arrest will be put in the system well before your gun purchase will be. I don't know if that is useful context for you on that one, but certainly my experience, Mr. Engineer, is also that unless the state wants to underwrite those data systems, having an accurate reporting for those sovereign nations is difficult when trying to get the full criminal history image.
Thank you. Judge Leiden, do you have any input on what's needed when somebody appears before you in court for you to make decisions?
I mean, the more information, the better, obviously. You know, one of the things I've learned is that Whatcom seems to be ahead of the curve on LAP or lethality assessments coming into prosecutors' possession before arraignments. I think that's quite helpful. I know that there's a push to make that more standardized throughout the state. Certainly that would be great. I mean, I think everybody understands this, but the more information people can have, especially about firearms purchase, and if it was recent in time, that certainly would be nice. I think that's the intent of the legislation. Again, the legislation probably lags behind the logistics behind the legislation quite a bit. But yeah, I mean, we all know what the statistics are, especially with gun fascination close in time. Go ahead. I'll stand aside for Mr. Majumdar.
Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Your Honor. I was just going to make clear, I have no ability to fulfill the legislative mandate. I have no access to DOL to get firearms records as a small town municipal part-time prosecutor. And what I want to get to the judges is, I'd love to get them the firearms records. I'd love to get them the LAP form. I'd love to get them in criminal history, as well as a PC statement of ASAP. But the fact of the matter is there's no mechanism for me to provide that firearms purchase data for certain. And, you know, in Blaine, I think the judge requires, or at least we try to require the police station to send that LAP form along with the PC. So that's helpful for us.
I do think there's questions about firearm possession. Perhaps maybe the LAP form should say if there's any, maybe we could include that as known purchases recently or something like that.
I think that's something DV SAS might have worked on, and so I can check with Carol on that. But I know that the LAP form was worked on together as a group in a committee at some point, and so I can ask if they want to make modifications to who would be that person. Alex, you're nodding your head. Do you know specifically?
Oh, no, I'm just a head nodder, but
Okay, no, that's great. I'm like, I know Carol had talked about it a while back. Carol Donovan with the domestic violence advocate. She's told me about the LAP form and how it was brought, but I don't have all the specifics in front of me. But I know the fingerprinting, making sure that those records are being transmitted. That's something that we need to do a better job on. I know with the jail restrictions, that's been an issue because not everybody is being booked, and when they're not being booked, they're not being fingerprinted. COVID had a little bit of an issue there. So trying to update that would be helpful. And then Alex, you also mentioned something earlier when we spoke about the Department of Licensing having a lag time on entering that. And I thought you said 2 years, but I wasn't positive. So if you could fill us in on that information.
So that was 2 years pre-COVID, when Washington State Patrol started the move towards single points. The Department of Licensing hasn't released numbers on what their lag time currently is, given the intention of Washington State Patrol to take over being the controller of those records. So we don't, it's a little bit of a question mark. And then as we're transitioning systems from Department of Licensing holding that information to Washington State Patrol, it's also going to be an unknown what that lag time looks like. So data accuracy will continue to be really important for the local agencies, right? Like any information you report needs to be as accurate and as prompt as possible to give them the best chance to get it into the system. Just like the fingerprinting. If you don't do the fingerprinting, there's no way to link that to an existing criminal history record. So those are the pieces we control when these other larger entities are trying to fix things on their end as well.
Thank you. Is there any other questions or comments from the group in reference to this matter? Everybody's silent. And I think, we still have some time yet. So if there's anything else that people think that we should look at or try to fill these gaps. I know that Caleb said the index committee hadn't been meeting a lot lately, but they're hoping to up that. So trying to figure out how to get these records. Rajiv and Doug Hildall, if you have any ideas on how we can contact the tribes to get more input so that we can have that history available to all the courts in Whatcom County too, and provide that information to us, that would be awesome. Bruce, do you have any input?
I do not.
Maya?
Just on the criminal history from the tribes, they're not constitutional courts, and so we do not think that our state courts should be considering that history. So that's my position, and so I don't think it would be appropriate to bring that in, but I mean, maybe that's for a different venue to argue. I'm sorry, I have to take a call.
No, I appreciate your comments, Maya. And I have concerns. I also see that some of the stuff is mandated by the legislator. So it's like we're supposed to provide it, but we can't provide it. But there's a lot of different things that are controversial when it comes to that, including firearms, when somebody has to surrender a firearm and not be in possession, but surrender it. So there's a lot of issues there that are kind of separate from this matter, but any thoughts on that being an issue that Maya brought up?
Well, Rajiv makes a very good point, and that is that there is no electronic back and forth between the state and the tribes. If prosecutors are going to want to individually search out criminal history through researching particular cases from a tribe, that may be a problematic.
Thank you. Judge Freeman, do you have any input on this?
Well, my experience is pretty dated on this. I would just remind, I understand that it is the legislative intent that we have access to that information, but the tribes are sovereign nations. It's no different than making a request from, British Columbia. And the fact is there is no obligation on them to provide it. And in my experience, it was hit and miss as a prosecutor going back 15 years ago. And it likely dependent on the type of case and the reason behind it. So while the legislature might want us to consider that, ultimately it's not our information to get if the tribes don't want to. So.
Thank you. I appreciate the insight. I think it's helpful for other people as well to understand, especially when there's a lot of people asking us to make sure that we're being fair to everybody and we're getting all the information. So that's needed. Rajiv Majumdar.
Yeah, I'd just say that if I knew there was history, I've never had a problem with cooperation with both of our tribes and inside the bounds of our county, Lummi and Nooksack. They've always been very positive towards sharing what information they can. But of course, that's active reach of information as opposed to passively just easily gleaning at information.
Thank you. And then bringing this back to trying to make sure that we're seeing people in a timely manner so that they don't have to stay incarcerated. An issue that I've seen with the small cities is that the funding availability of courtroom space in custody isn't always beneficial. For an individual that would normally be seen on Tuesday, they get booked on a Wednesday or Thursday night. For some of the small cities, they wouldn't necessarily be seen until the following Tuesday in custody. And we share the courtroom with Whatcom County Superior Court, Whatcom County District Court, Bellingham Municipal Court. There's one courtroom and we have to be open to the public and we need to get all of this information too in a timely manner. So something to think about in the future would to make sure that there's more space for the small cities and that the small cities are funded adequately to provide prosecution and defense and judges to be available on a more timely manner. I don't know if anybody else has thought about that. I just noticed that there's sometimes that we'd like to get people out sooner or that we'd like to hear them in person sooner. And there is a struggle, I think, with having the space at the jail. Especially when we're trying to get somebody heard on a in between court hearings if it's not a Tuesday morning. Any comments on that? Silence.
I agree with you. I also think that the new probation rules are creating some issues. Again, the laws are coming quick, especially the ones that change procedure. But I agree that that's a big issue. A 7-day, once every 7 days shouldn't cut it in the future. We need to find a little bit more way to adjudicate these things. Zoom would be a great start.
Thank you. I need to go back. I don't know if there's any other comments or discussion on this unless somebody raises their hand. I'm going to move on to other business. Is there anything that anybody else wants to bring up for future meetings? I know, Maya, we're hopefully looking at you being able to speak at the September meeting on defense needs and concerns. Is there anything else that we feel that's pertinent for the next meeting? And silence. Oh darn, we're going to have to adjourn early. Oh, Rajiv Majumdar.
I gotta jump like the rest of you to our busy lives, but I don't regularly come to these, but I just wanted to thank all of you for all working together to try to make all the systems flow better and constitutionally. So I know how much you guys volunteer and put your time into this, so thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank everybody for joining me today and joining the Legal and Justice Subcommittee, and hope to see you in the future. Thank you. We're adjourned.